But even if it's a failure, well, it didn't cost you hardly anything, right? And it took almost no time. And the process of creation, especially for something new, is just fundamentally fun. I mean, the vision with Blockade Labs, when you really draw back the lens, is this idea we've been talking about for coming up on a year now, called text game. And the idea is that today, if you wanted to create a prototype of a game, that prototype would take a lot of work, like somewhere between weeks and years worth of work, depending on the complexity of your concept. And that means that we can't go after really wild ideas. We can't prototype them because it doesn't make sense, because they're probably not going to work. But in a world where you have your crazy idea, you type it in or you say it to the AI and you'd say, like, I want to test a survival game set in Victorian Europe with mice as characters and all lines are sung and there's a dynamic that involves banana guns. I don't know. Like, that would be a dumb game to prototype in real life. But if you do that and then it cascades its way through different various AI engines, of which Blockade would be one, we see ourselves fitting into that in the environments area, but also in the textures area and also in the meshes area. Then at the end of that process, maybe a couple hours later, depending on kind of the complexity of what you're doing, you have a prototype and you can play with that prototype. And that prototype means that, that idea that your 9-year-old had, that's like a terrible idea to you that no human, adult would ever want to do, but turns out it's amazing for 9-year-olds and they freaking love it, right? Like that game gets to get made now, and you could create a prototype, which then gets shared. And that prototype then gets popular, and now suddenly your 9-year-old, has like a giant viral franchise.
Welcome back to another episode of Meta Rick, where we talk about technology, like the blockchain, AI, and the metaverse, all of these new emerging kind of deep tech. And we like to talk with creatives and technologists about this stuff, the builders that are kind of creating this in the space, and then looking at it through a go-to-market lens on how to market this to consumers, how to work with businesses. Today's guest, we got Adam B. Levine. Adam is one of the all-time visionaries and that's out here kind of disrupting things. You may be familiar with Blockade Labs from the videos that have been going viral on their AI generation of skyboxes. It works a little bit like DALL-E 2 or Midjourney, where you create a prompt, and then you set your style, and then within seconds they generate these skyboxes. And if you're unfamiliar, the skybox is essentially a 360 wrap that goes around a virtual environment. So that could be a web-based game, that could be a VR space. And the way I always like to explain it to people is it's kind of like an old movie set, where you'd create like a Western backdrop of a desert, and then you'd have a set of a saloon in front of it, and the actors would look like they're in that old Western environment. This skybox is doing the same thing for a virtual space with 3D objects and avatars. So Adam, I couldn't be more excited to learn more about your story, how you got involved with Blockade Labs and creating this technology. Maybe we could start with a little bit about your backstory, where you come from, and then we can kind of work our way towards Blockade Labs.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the invite, Ricky. I always love talking about these types of topics. So going back to kind of before talking about professional stuff, my life has been characterized by trying to make sure that I have as many options as possible, and that I never am in a situation where I have to do something because somebody wants me to, but I think it's a really dumb idea. It's just the way that I am, always been. A lot of people like that. That led me down the sort of disruptive technology path, because disruptive technologies, again, without talking about anything specific, are basically technologies that take something that either you need to have a lot of money to do, or is impossible to do, or you need to have a lot of skill to do, and that skill is very expensive, both in terms of time and sometimes in terms of money, to learn. And so when you're looking at a disruptive technology, really what you're seeing is a better path towards doing that thing. And there's tons and tons in our world that needs to be disrupted in this way. We need better ways to do almost all of the things, because many of our systems that we use today were invented hundreds of years ago sometimes, and they made total sense for then. They were even, visionary and innovative for the time. But you look at where we are today, and the possibilities are so important. So I have kind of lived my life on two sides of a fence. On one side is journalism. And journalism, again, I'm really not interested in education, but I'm really interested in educating myself. And so I've taken it upon myself many times over the last 15, 20 years to go down rabbit holes. And down those rabbit holes, I tend to be pretty early. I tend to be there talking with engineers mostly. And my superpower early on was the ability to talk to those engineers, understand what they're doing, and then help explain it to other people in much the same way that you do. And so I got my start back doing podcasts in 2005 in kind of the gaming space and used it as an entry there. And then I went into sales, and my first disruptive technology was bioplastics, biodegradable plastics created from typically from like corn or feedstock or something like that. So a lot of the stuff you see in like Whole Foods today, my company innovated back in 2007, 2008. And then I got involved with disruptive permaculture and what was it? Drone technology and Bitcoin. And I had a publication from 2011 to 2013 that was kind of focused on all of those things. And then the drone stuff got stuck behind patents. The 3D printing stuff got stuck behind patents. The permaculture stuff, once it's planted, you just need about 10 years, to actually get stuff going. But Bitcoin wasn't stuck behind any of those walls. And it was kind of having its moment, back when the price bubbled up to $200 and everybody was like, oh my gosh, what will this thing go to? And I kind of found myself in the right place, right time, where I was able to connect the dots between all of these incredibly smart people talking about incredibly early ideas of what you could do with decentralization and what you could do with system infrastructure that didn't require you to have some person sitting in the middle of the web. But instead, the web was just created by all of the people at the edges of the network interacting with each other. That's a core innovation that kind of Bitcoin introduced in the blockchain space. And it was a really interesting idea to me because I think that a lot of the problems we have in our world today are about concentrations of power. Concentrations of power are inevitably abused. And so if you can figure out alternative ways to organize that don't require you to have those concentrations, then there's really interesting grounds to be tread there. So that podcast was right place, right time. I hooked up with Andreas Antonopoulos, among other people, and we were pretty systemically important for a couple of years. I then parlayed that into basically doing some of the earliest experiments with non-currency tokens. So this was back in late 2013 through early 2015. And I built out a tokenized rewards program for my podcast network. Excuse me. That tokenized rewards program was the largest use of non-currency tokens, for about 2 or 3 years. And this was way too early. So I wound up starting a technology company to build all of the different tools that I needed, everything from on-chain wallets in the style that you now see MetaMask doing, to tokenized vending machines and the way that you look at something like Uniswap, and that operates in largely the same way. We built all this stuff about 6 years too early and powered a lot of kind of the early experiences. And so that was both amazing. It was the first time I'd ever started a company. And also it was kind of terrible because there's nothing quite like being right, but being 6 years too early and not having enough money to actually survive to that point. So long story short, I went back into kind of the journalism side, talked my way into a job at CoinDesk that didn't exist, built a podcast network for them that became the most profitable part of the company over the course of 18 months. And then I got addicted to early versions of the AI generative art stuff that today looks like total garbage. It was very, very expensive too. But basically that led me to hiring the guy who had built the first Discord bot that was doing creation. This came out of the I forget the community name actually. I want to say Euler, but that's a different thing. But anyways, I hired that guy, and we basically started building what would become a platform called PixelMind. That platform called PixelMind, along with my company, was then merged into Blockade Labs. We did that because I went to this event in New York that Union Square Ventures put on called Promptopia in October of last year, I think. And this was right after Stable Diffusion had come out. And I looked at some of the projects that people were working on there, and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm usually really early to this stuff, but I actually feel behind. And more importantly, what's obvious is that if you don't focus on one particular deep thing that you're going to do the best out of anything, out of anybody else who's out there, then you're going to lose the race. And it's such a race. It's such a race. It's not even funny. So I'd known Marguerite since back in the Let's Talk Bitcoin days. She had done some of the earliest on-chain games, some of the earliest on-chain puzzles, notably one called The Hunt for Satoshi Nakamoto that used our tokenized forum system with again, like her puzzle encryption of like putting a Bitcoin private key into a picture or something like that. It was wild. I never played it. It was way too hard for me, but I provided a platform for it, and we had gotten to know each other. And Blockade Games, which is the precursor to the organization that we are today, was this kind of Web3 game startup that she had started that ran Neon District, which was one of the very large early free-to-play games. And they done Plasma Bears, which was one of the first, I think, programmable NFTs. And just in general had been total innovators in that space. And so she spent a long time convincing me, actually, that games were the vertical I should go after, because I wasn't convinced. I was like, games are hard. But so anyways, we went forward with the merger. That merger started the process, basically like last December, and then, merged the teams together very, very quickly, and then just got running on product. That led to Skybox. Skybox was the second idea that we had, and it took off right away. We started building it in January. My team had done a bunch of work in advance, so we had all the infrastructure already built for it. But that product didn't exist at all until like the end of January. We launched it mid-February. There's a funny story about why we launched it so fast, but I won't get to it right now.
Well, let's take a quick pause, because there's a lot.
No, that's fine.
Like,
I talk, man.
your story is incredible, because like you've touched so many different parts of this concept of deep tech, of emerging technology. I love the way Eric Redmond talks about it from MIT, where it's like technology that is so new that we can't really understand where it will end up or where it will go, but once it's here, it'll be so integral to society that we couldn't imagine a world without it in our culture, right? And I think there's so much overlap between these technologies, right? Because every time you create something so new and innovative, it creates new problems. And then oftentimes other emerging technologies step in to solve those problems. So like I was talking to Diego Borgo on the podcast recently, and one of the things he talked about was how AI creates problems that the blockchain might be able to help solve. And then blockchain creates problems that AI might be able to help solve. And so if you're going to be interested in Web3, you kind of have to have a little bit of an interest in both to have like a comprehensive outlook on it. And so your background, having been so just curious and committed to exploring all these different ideas, I imagine that's helped you a lot on your journey. One question I was going to have, though, is about when you got into all the Bitcoin stuff, way early, right? And you're dabbling with creating all these ideas around it. At this point, how are you funding this stuff? Do you still have the sales job? Is it from flipping Bitcoin? Like, how are you funding all these projects at the time? And like food, like being able to like survive.
So that's fair. So the long and the short of it is that when my wife and I decided that we were going to do permaculture, my parents have a property that has a whole bunch of commercially non-viable like forested mountain that I was like, yeah, let's plant some food forests, right? This was right before. So we moved up to my parents' house, and we were living in a tiny house on the property that had been like an old loom room. So it was maybe like 250 square feet, something like that. So I found myself in a situation where I could just treat everything like a complete startup. And it was like the least expensive startup ever. The upside and downside was I didn't pay myself. I didn't really pay much to anybody else for those early things. The reason to do the token, honestly, for the Let's Talk Bitcoin network was because I wanted to figure out how do I, on the off chance that this thing becomes valuable in the future, how can I assign sort of responsibility in a way that could turn into something valuable for people who are participating now when I obviously can't pay them, and where they're not even asking for money. But I wanted to figure out a way to recognize that. And the beautiful part...
That's essentially like an NFT, right? But like before where we've gone with them now.
They weren't really NFTs, no. It was more like, without getting into the whole system, because that's a whole other conversation. But basically, I set up a 5-year distribution schedule for a fungible token. This was before, we created tokens that had a supply of one, but it was like everything wanted to be Bitcoin at that point. This was way before Ethereum. Basically you would, we were like, okay, we're going to do weekly distributions because we had to do all this manually. And so we're like, all right, so here's the distribution schedule, laying it out over the course of the 5-year period that I wanted. It was an exponential distribution schedule. And so then we had 3 different buckets. And one of those buckets was content creators. And that got like 40% of the tokens that were created weekly. And another bucket was the audience. And that was like 40% of the tokens that got created weekly. And then there was like an infrastructure thing, which was really paying me, for powering all of this and kind of keeping it going. Although that went into, again, like I said, I kind of incubated with my parents. So I pushed all that to one of their companies. And so basically then we had different incentivized activities where it's like if you visited a post for the first time that you hadn't visited before, then that was worth 3 points. And if you made a comment and that comment wasn't removed, then that was worth 10 points. And these points weren't tokens, they were points. And what they allowed us to do was they allowed us to have a fixed schedule that then let everybody in the various buckets compete with each other for who could do the most of the things in a way that didn't dilute their own actions. Because that was the thing, too, is like we used to have podcasters who sometimes would not post for a month and then post 3 episodes in a week, right? And so what wound up happening was because we had this weekly distribution cadence for the token, they would wind up competing with themselves. And it was a much better strategy for them to release 1 per week so that they got 1 chunk without diluting themselves of each of those kind of 3 things. So we did go to an NFT place later on. With some of the stuff, but ultimately the early days, like the only reasons why NFTs were really a thing, most people don't understand this, is because everybody was so enamored with raising money with tokens. And when they figured out that they couldn't raise money with tokens in the way that they've been talking about it, in the way that many of the lawyers in the space who were very smart had been suggesting would be totally acceptable and encouraging people to do, then people were like, oh, non-fungible tokens. If it's not fungible, then that must mean that it can't be a security. But of course, that was always the dumbest possible argument, because if you look at an actual like stock certificate, like what somebody would have had 50 years ago, it is quite literally a non-fungible certificate that has a specific number of specific number of shares associated with it.
It also like is, I think a big misconception a lot of people in the NFT space have is that an NFT isn't a contract. There's still a legal contract that's associated with that NFT that like still has to follow all the same laws that society follows. So
I mean, it's all so much more complicated because the people who are responsible for enforcing the rules don't like us.
Yeah.
like this would not be a problem if it wasn't for that. It's that, again, you look at this technology and what the Bitcoin technology in particular does, and tokens more generally do, is they take the incredible power that's vested, right, in sort of whoever controls the money or controls the supply of a thing, and they take that power out of their hands. And so if you look at the way our world works today, there isn't a single government that exists out there, US included, who, if you took the power to create money for arbitrary purposes that nobody agrees with but them, out of their hands, they collapse. The whole scheme collapses. So that gets to the kind of the underlying problem. And then you look at something like Wall Street, right? What does Wall Street do? Wall Street makes all of its money custodying people's tokens, which are actually securities, and giving them exclusive places where they have a monopoly on where they trade. The New York Stock Exchange has a monopoly on the things that trade there, right? And so it doesn't really matter what you're talking about. When you decentralize ownership in the way that tokens do, you are looking at some of the wealthiest, most powerful kind of segments, and you're saying, you know what? You're fired, and we have a better way that doesn't need you, and none of them like that. So it's been very challenging just because there's all this ambiguity that could be drained out of the situation so easily by the people in charge, but their incentives are actually the opposite. It's to add ambiguity. It's to add stuff. And the Stoner Cats thing, I don't know if you saw that. That's the most recent example of kind of the securities regulator going absolutely nuts and doing something that is totally conflicting with their mandate, but it increases ambiguity in the space. And so long as you're biasing towards that, it's a great choice, just not for us.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is with that division and mindset, like it creates this us against them mindset, and then it attracts a lot of degeneracy into the crypto space and prevents some of like the more practical folks that could be using it for real use cases from entering into it. Like, for example, with like the idea of digital ownership, I think there's something there, like the idea of like owning something digitally and using the chain to do that. The way that NFTs have happened with like generative PFP projects don't make any sense to me, but I do think that there is something to this idea of digital ownership. And one of the issues though is that you see something like FTX like fall apart. And that has nothing to do with digital ownership. That's completely focused on decentralized finance. And everyone hears about it and they associate it with crypto, and then they just take these use cases and like merge them together and are like, it's all corrupt. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Like, let's rethink things a little bit. And so I think every time you have one of these big scandals, it like kind of taints the entire the entire space. Like that entire technology gets this like perception, right?
I mean, you're not wrong, but I don't know that I care about that, right? Like I think that when you're looking at the problems in the world today, again, if you try and understand things through the lens in which they're presented, then a lot of stuff doesn't make any sense. But if you just look at them through that power lens, then a lot of stuff makes sense. And it's a lot easier. Again, it's a much simpler story. And that simpler story just seems like it's right. So, I mean, so the complexity here is that both perspectives are correct in their way, which is that it has been a problem since the very earliest days, going back to maybe 2015, right? Like Spells of Genesis. Although you can take it back to 2013, people figured out that you could use tokens to raise money. And that was just like, whoa, like that's amazing. And then people who bought those tokens figured out that if you bought these tokens, then they could make money too, without taking that money back from the people who gave it to them. So that's a real dynamic, and it's a dynamic that would always play in the way that it has to a certain extent, but it's been exacerbated by a couple of factors. One of the factors is that we live in an age of monetary mania. We live at the end of a long cycle where the money is in the process of breaking. It has been in the process for 50 years. The acceleration has been going on for about 10 years. And within about 10 years, we'll be in a different system. That reality of that kind of end thing, if you look back at like Weimar Germany, there were some behavioral changes that happened there that are pretty identical to what we have going on, which is that if the value of your money is going down, and then there's no point in saving. And if everything is so expensive, then you might as well have a good time because it's not going to be worth that much money later on, right? Obviously, like in the part of Weimar that we remember is the part that's the super hyperinflation, but that was not like, that was the end of a much longer process. And we're not at that part of the process yet, and maybe we'll never get there, but we're at an earlier part of that process, and it's what you see here. So like the path that I've taken in my life is what I call the lottery ticket lifestyle, right? So I'm actually a really risk conservative person in many ways, but when it comes to figuring out what am I going to work on, I see no reason to work for anything that isn't going to provide me with a chance that maybe I never have to work again because I get lucky. And my personal problem is that I don't want to do that by speculating on tokens. I think that speculating on tokens is a fundamentally brain polluting activity that makes it so that to the extent that you are correct about what tokens are going to do and therefore able to make money off of it, you kind of have to train your brain to be stupid in ways that are really detrimental in other parts of your life. And you also have to put on kind of like a team jersey a lot of times, right? Because you're so invested in the thing that it actually changes how you think about stuff. So people have long kind of, not intending it as a negative thing, but referred to me as a Bitcoiner. And I even reject that. I've always rejected that. I think that, again, to the extent that you put on one of these ideological jerseys, it impedes your ability to take in new information and adapt your perspective. And that process there is entirely the reason why I've been as successful as I have, is because not always, but sometimes I'm able to just be like, oh, not only does this technology exist, but now let's re-examine all of the questions that I asked myself over the course of the last several years, or last 20 years at this point, where the answer was, no, that's impossible. What if that is still impossible? And what if it's possible now? And that's then led to kind of everything that I've done over the last, 13 years.
Yeah, I love how you touch on this idea of like keeping your mind open and like reassessing information, because I think when we work on any of these technologies we're talking about, right? Like the blockchain example, you really emphasized it, but this is true in XR, this is true in AI, it's true in all of these these pieces of technology, is like we end up in an echo chamber where you have a lot of people that are so focused on building and they're very focused on how it's being accomplished. And like we are able to do this thing we couldn't do last year. And it is exciting. It's why we're working on it. It's why it attracts a lot of people that are able to accomplish those things, because they're driven by that. But the problem is we lose sight sometimes that that's a very small percentage of the population, and the end user who's actually going to benefit from that innovation maybe doesn't care so much about how we accomplish it, or maybe that thing we accomplished wasn't built for them. It was just built because it was cool to build. And I think that's a big issue we see, especially on the kind of Web3 side of this stuff,
Definitely.
is building to build cool stuff instead of building things that are going to be used.
I mean, so I tried to do that for a long time. I built a complete e-commerce platform called tokenmarkets.com. I built a complete music streaming platform called tokenfm.com, and I built 3 or 4 other things of that scope with the idea entirely that I was building these for early majority audiences. And there are just a lot of challenges with that approach. And even today, there are a lot of challenges with that approach. In some ways, it was easier when I was doing it before, back 2015, 2016, because the generational wealth meme was not so prominent for most people. There, you just had to deal with the fact that people didn't care and mostly didn't understand why they would ever care, which is reasonable. Again, like, we're talking about the fundamental reinvention of ownership systems, which is incredibly powerful, but super abstract. And I mean, I can't even tell you how many times I explain to people, well, when you buy a ebook on, or when you buy an audiobook on Audible, you think that you own it, but actually you don't own it. You have permission to listen to it from Audible. But if you were to go over to someplace else and use it there, then they wouldn't know anything because you don't really own it. You just have a license from this company. And that's true. And it's even kind of important to some people, but it still doesn't matter, right? The friction that comes along with these new types of systems and the responsibility that comes along with having true ownership is actually a huge challenge.
So that one right there is under talked about a lot, right? So like when I dabbled in the NFT space for a little bit because I wanted to learn. Like there's so many people that were drawn into it, so I was like, I want to figure out why and like what is the thing that I can learn from this boom of this industry kind of taking off. The biggest thing I took away from it was marketing, honestly. Like, how do you build a community and focus on a community? And I watched it get done wrong a lot of times and was like, oh, this is how you build a bad community. This is how you overpromise and underdeliver. And I learned a lot about how wrong that can go, how quickly. But one of the things that stood out very early on is like, I think it's like a rite of passage in crypto to like send some crypto into the ether of nothingness at one point or another. Like, scams just happen when you're this early. And so it happened to me once, and I just remember sending off a few $100s into nothing, and I just realized my mistake immediately. And I sat with it, and I was like, there's no one else who's responsible. I did this. There's no recourse. It's on me. I just have to learn this and move on. And I've seen it happen to a lot of people where they freak out, and they start spamming the Discord mods, and they're trying to figure out recourse. And the reality is not every person can be expected to be a cybersecurity expert and like completely perfect every step of their own personal security. So I think my 2 takeaways from that experience for me is, one, cybersecurity and education around that is really important. Where virtual communication is becoming bigger and bigger, the idea of virtual ownership, the idea of interacting in virtual spaces. In a world like that, everyone does need to raise the minimum bar of education around how to protect yourself online. That's one thing. But the second thing is, you do want to outsource some stuff. You want third parties to provide you with support mechanisms and insurance and things if stuff goes wrong. Like, so over the course of society, we didn't just build those things for no reason. Like, the example I always use is, if you go back to medieval times, you're going to go pay a blacksmith to make a sword. You're not going to just do it with a rock in your backyard, Like, it's important to kind of outsource some of these things.
Yeah, it's definitely important. And I mean, just life is about trade-offs, right? And so like the pitch forever in terms of with Bitcoin has been be your own bank. And that's true. And you can, but there are costs to it. And those costs are, monetary in the case of actually sending money to something, but they're also just like stress. Like there's a reasonable amount of it. And, like I wouldn't go back as far as like medieval times, although I'll take that example too. But I mean, just go back to the dawn of the credit card, right? And it's like a credit card by itself is a terrible way to pay for anything. It's basically a check with a lot more trust involved in some ways. But what they did that will eventually happen with all of these things is there are layers and wrappers that go around them that make it so that the transaction feels instant, right? Even though it's really not. Really, there's some trust going on in the background, and somebody's making money off of it, which means you're paying some money for it. Like that abstraction is important because you don't care about the cost if it means that the experience is much better. And more importantly, if it lowers the cognitive burden, right? If it means that you don't have to make decisions about it so much as it's just obvious. And like, that's a beautiful thing that will eventually happen for these other technologies too. But it does mean that right now, whether you're talking about sending something to a scam or you're talking about like the folks in my network, I can tell you, have lost crypto in various ways of almost any variety that you can possibly imagine. In some cases, very large amounts of money. And so it's not even necessarily about being careful. It's just like you're close to the iron, right? Like those protective wrappers and those protective layers, they just don't exist yet. So yeah, I mean, this is the tension. This is why you get people saying, oh, look at that exchange failure. This is why everyone needs to self-custody. And then some people go in self-custody, maybe, 1/10 of 1% of them lose some money. And then they tell friends and they're like, oh, well, this is hard and scary. I want to go back and be over there because those guys look like they know what they're doing, right? And what we keep finding out is that anybody who looks like they know what they're doing, to your point about marketing, usually doesn't. Usually they're just good at marketing and good at like explaining about why you should trust them. But then actually behind the scenes, they're total basket cases. I couldn't believe the recent thing with BitGo where it's like, turns out we've been, I'm not following the news that closely, so maybe it's not BitGo, but one of the custodial companies that was out there that was like, turns out we lost money 2 years ago and we've just been insolvent all this time. We didn't tell anybody because we didn't get caught. Right? Like, that's ridiculous. Like, they were one of the more trusted parties in the space. And the same is true of FTX. So, like I bring it all back to the monetary mania, right? Like, people's behavior is so being influenced by the place that we're at right now, by all the pressure we feel to make as much money as we can, and what we're willing to do in order to do that, what risks we're willing to take. And crypto also is like the most perfect cork for this environment, right? It just kind of floats on the surface of the liquidity. And so when liquidity goes up, its price goes up. When liquidity goes down, its price goes down. That's not normal market behavior. So people who are good at this, like I said before, have kind of had to train themselves to be wrong about how markets really work, but right about how markets work today when we're in this really stupid broken phase. So I'll stop talking, but yeah, no, it's a fascinating area.
No, it's super interesting, and like it shows how much time you've put into the industry, because like you're obviously very, very knowledgeable about it and like
Cynical
have references over a long period of time. But also there's like this realism that comes with when you go through bear cycles and bull cycles more than once. It's like, frankly, I'm still a little bit newer to it myself when it comes to the Web3 stuff. Like, I've been around crypto since I was in high school. I've had friends that have been more into it, and I've slowly learned more and more about it. But this most recent cycle, and maybe the 2015 one, is really when I started leaning in a little bit more to figure it out. Started hosting whiteboarding sessions with friends to like brainstorm where's this stuff going and try and teach each other about it, like create little support groups online and in person, actually. But I kind of want to take a pivot here and talk a little bit about before Blockade Labs still, but when you went into CoinDesk and pitched them on this idea of creating essentially a podcast or a media outlet for them. I think that's really interesting because I'm seeing a trend across business in general right now. And I've been pitching this without having a product for it for like 5 years. Like I would constantly talk about this idea of corporate bingeable content, where every day we are working and we're staring at Teams calls and Zoom calls and webinars and email. And you'd think that when work is over, we would immediately take a sprint outside, get some sunshine, go to the beach, go for a hike. But we don't. We binge Squid Games, right? Like, we still watch Netflix. We still watch whatever's on HBO. And so people have this want to watch more content, but now corporate content is competing with AAA games. It's competing with streaming. It's competing with blockbuster movies. And it's competing with the creator economy of streamers, right? And so there's this need for corporate content to level up and find a way to like create either higher production or more interesting stories. So we're starting to see this with like Salesforce Plus, with NetApp TV. There's startups like Audience Plus that are trying to make this a reality and more scalable. But you did this early, before all these platforms were taking off. You pitched this concept of kind of allowing a media outlet for CoinDesk. So maybe you could talk us about like what sparked the idea for you, and then how did you position that to CoinDesk to get them on board? And then maybe even just a little bit about the process of building that.
Yeah, so I mean, my process is very organic with all of this stuff. I basically just go around and talk to people. I'm not great at building relationships. I tend to be more interested in stuff than people. So people typically have to seek me out. But so it's 2018, summer of, and I have just spent a year solid trying to get someone to invest in exchange for equity rather than a token into the first tokenized streaming platform and the first tokenized album platform, right? Which I had built, and I just failed. It had gone terribly because everybody wanted a token, and I was like, yeah, but a token's going to be illegal, and they're like, shut up. And so it was the most frustrating and demoralizing year of my life because I had built the thing that I wanted to build and thought was going to be really important, and I just couldn't get any buy-in whatsoever from the folks who had the money because there was so much distraction with kind of all the speculative opportunities. So I had sold the podcast network. I had sold LTB Network to David Bailey over at BTC Media, who also owns Bitcoin Magazine. It was the first end of life also for a token, as far as I can tell, where there was a token swap into something else. That was worth something for a while and then wasn't worth it after the ICO era. And I had known Pete Rizzo, just kind of ships passing in the night. He had started, actually he hadn't started, but CoinDesk had gotten started about the same time that I got started with Let's Talk Bitcoin. And so we'd always, kind of been friendly, not really rivals. I don't really do drama. And so I had talked to him a couple of times about syndicating the Let's Talk Bitcoin show, at that point called Speaking of Bitcoin, onto the podcast network. And the conversation from there actually, turned into, well, it'd be interesting if you created a network for us. And I was like, yeah, I could do that. And it was really great, actually. I loved working for CoinDesk. It was a funny story, though, because I went in at a really unique time. So I'm going to sign papers in like a week. And then Pete gets fired. Pete's the editor-in-chief, totally runs the show, makes all these decisions. And he gets fired for reasons that are totally unrelated to anything other than his relationship with management, as far as I can tell, and which is DCG, right? So Barry's company. They just disagreed about direction. And so I found myself for about 6 months with very limited guidance and very limited really anything for a corporate job. And CoinDesk is very corporate in terms of like all the accoutrements and trainings and stuff like that.
How many employees when you came
I
on
think
board?
it was maybe 40 or 50, and by the time I left they were up to 110, something like that. They've now come down again because they've either getting ready to be sold or they are just been sold, something like that. So stuff has changed a lot over there in the last 6 months or so.
That's pretty small, right? But for a media company, would that be considered pretty sizable?
The biggest media company I'd ever worked for by a long shot. Typically, again, like I'm a go-to bootstrappy indie, right? Mm-hmm. So like the way that I'm successful with building platforms typically is that I will identify an early technology community that has specific affinities for certain things that I feel passionate about. I'll start then putting out a lot of opinion content, covering the news, bring in other people to join me with that, amplify their voices as well, which then means I can do less of that work and more of kind of the strategic work, shows, stuff like that. So the process of creating a network and the process of creating a new show in general is really hard, and it's really different based on what's the media environment that you're in. So the media environment that I was in at that point was right before, it was kind of the end of the bear market. I went in maybe, like 9 months before the bear really started to turn. And it was really great because nobody cared. And so we just created content, and I came up with a couple of new shows. The big success that I had was identifying NLW, Nathaniel Whittemore, as, not just like a service provider, because he actually did some consulting for CoinDesk when I met him. But he had this show on YouTube called Crypto 3 at 3 that he'd been doing for like 3 months, every day, and it had like 100 views per episode. But it was pretty good. And so I talked with him about it, and we figured out, I was like, hey, let's rebrand this, and we worked on intros and stuff like that, and kind of recast it as The Breakdown. And then came out with that, and that was pretty much immediately off to the races. I personally had been doing another show called Markets Daily, which was intended to be kind of like, crypto news for somebody who would typically listen to CNBC or something like that.
Well, and all of this is like before podcasting really took off, right? Like Joe Rogan had been around, and like there were like a few podcasts doing all right, but
I mean, I don't know.
but like I feel like really these last like I don't know maybe like 3 years, like COVID really amplified all of it to another level. Like I think that there's a shift from in studio high production podcasts to more of these kind of virtual, like what we're doing right now with Riverside, and like the
technology has
production
definitely helped.
tools have gotten better. The ability to have a high quality microphone in your home has gotten easier. So I'm curious, did you guys have like your own dedicated space where people would fly in, or how did
I was
you set
completely
up the
remote. No,
production?
CoinDesk was an entirely remote thing. I was supposed to go to their office a couple of times, but then the COVID lockdowns hit, and CoinDesk locked down super hard. So that ended that. It was really interesting because I worked for them for about 2.5 years, and I never actually went to the office. You know, I have a different opinion about it, just as far as like the progression of the thing. Like I said, back in 2005, it was already possible to do this stuff on a shoestring budget with relatively high production quality. You just had to care. My first AI project actually was I'm an audio editor by trade. If you go back to like the schooling that I did. And I'm kind of an obsessive audio editor. So I would, in like the early days of LTB and stuff, like go through individual episodes and silence all of the breath noises and then respace the gaps because now it's a little too long. But if you just get rid of that, then you get these really clean, really understandable things. And I find that if you remove vocal clutter from recordings, especially of more technical people, then they're so much more accessible and so much easier to understand. And so the early days of Let's Talk Bitcoin was talking to somebody who's really smart on the Bitcoin engineering side, them not being understandable really at all, me going through and doing 1,000 edits on a 45-minute interview, and then at the end of it, they sound incredibly articulate and amazing. So I tried
the Dr. Dre of podcasting, sitting there like just every word one at a time.
Like I said, it was ridiculous. I felt very passionately about it though. So I did it, and as time went on, as the years passed, I was like, this is really time consuming, and I'm not having as much fun as I used to. So I both hired editors, and I tried to build a product called Breathless Technologies that I love the name for. Which was about 5 or 6 years ago, an AI algorithm and training system where I worked with people in Venezuela and then paid them in Bitcoin for clicking a button that said, this is a breath or this is intentional speech, and you don't need to speak English to do that. So anyways, like the technology has definitely come up to do this fully remotely, especially with video. But if you were doing audio, like there were tools to do this even going back, 15 years. So the commercial success, I think, of podcasts, yes, that's definitely something that's happened more recently. But I would say that that's less about podcasts and more about how bad content has gotten in places where there is centralized control, right? So again, like the thing that we want is I don't even care if I agree with a person. Like I listen to more people who I don't agree with than I do agree with. What I care is that I can model how they're thinking about a thing. And I can follow their logic, and then I can grok and understand that logic in a way that is illuminating to me and that tells me something that I didn't already know. And I think that if you go to TV for that, good luck finding it.
Yeah,
right?
It's just not there.
It's not there.
That's a really good point. It's like these, like if you go to like news networks, it's like they're all centralized under these kind of two sides for the most part, right? And like there's also like big corporate brand sponsorships and stuff versus when you look at a lot of the podcasts, like they're smaller individual groups. There's some studios, right? Like Barstool Sports owns like 20, 30 podcasts. Like there are these networks that have like groups of them, but they're only successful if they give a certain level of autonomy to the hosts, because that's what makes them popular is the fact that the host has their personality and like some control. But I think in outside of the big production studios, like most of the sponsorships even tend to be products that the podcast hosts use themselves or have a relationship with. Like it's the honesty, I feel like tends to come out a little bit more as in that outlet. So even if the information's not fully flushed out where it's a full on perfect expert every time, I think people are more willing to listen to things they trust and can understand than trying to figure out what the perfect, most accurate truth is.
I mean, we're all biased. We all have our own perspectives on things. So the only way that we can even hope to get towards some rational version of truth is by hearing what a lot of people think and then synthesizing it yourself and making those decisions. So, I mean, like the challenge around a lot of media is that it's important, right? And podcasts are important now too. So I don't think that it's going to be unique. I don't think that the pressure that exists in other forms that has frankly made them as lousy as they are doesn't exist in podcasts. I think we see it all the time. Every time somebody talks about how Joe Rogan needs to be pulled because he had this guest on, or, you know, there's just a whole variety of things. Like, I wouldn't put Joe Rogan necessarily on the ideological spectrum, but that thing I was talking about earlier with crypto, like politics does that worse than anything else. And so you wind up with kind of, it's not about what's true, it's about what's going to hurt the other guy and what's going to make people agree with the thing that I want them to agree with. And that's just a terrible way to do things. So it does fundamentally come down to trust. But I think that I think give it time, give it 10 years, 15 years. If we're on the same progression that we are now, which I hope we're not, but it's possible, then I think that podcasts wind up just as controlled and perhaps even more controlled. The AI thing, which we really haven't talked about at all, is of course, the big elephant in the room, which is that it changes everything about content in ways that are very hard to predict. But the one thing that we can say is that the kind of era where you were building a product, you know, like a movie or something like that, for an audience of, you know, 100 million people, and you only make money if it gets to 50 million people or more, I think that's just about over. I think it's got maybe 2 or 3 years left. And then I think we go to this really weird world where if I want to create, you know, a movie about something really stupid, you know, it takes me a day and it's all AI produced and it costs me maybe $100, and then I watch it. And if it's good, then maybe I share it someplace and maybe it turns into something bigger. But I mean, like, that is so fundamentally transformative, and it's not just movies, it's literally everything in every way you can imagine.
Yeah, it's interesting the point you bring up about like a couple of different points there. One of them is the politics thing of like people just being so far on left and right. And I interviewed Steve Grubbs from Victory XR recently, and like that's one of his big reasons for why he moved out of politics. He used to be a congressman in Iowa, and why he moved into the XR industry is because in politics, like, it's an important thing that people do this, but it's like these two polar conflicting ideas where people are just positioning against each other constantly. And the idea there is that hopefully you get to better ideas because you have these two opposite views that's land somewhere in the middle eventually. That's the concept in theory, at least. But that gets draining. That gets so draining to be in that environment for your career. And at some point, the XR industry became attractive to him because the tech's really cool, but also because it's this welcoming, very partnership forward environment where I think it attracts a very different type of culture. And I've felt that myself. Like, I feel like even direct competitors, like, everyone wants everyone to win right now. Like, it's about building the industry, not about defeating your competitor right now. And so I think this helps us lean back into more of what you're doing now with Blockade Labs, right? So with Blockade Labs, like, they were kind of a crypto gaming company, like Blockade Games or Web3 gaming company, and then you were more of like an AI company innovating on the AI side.
Co-creation platform is what I built. So the idea was that AI stuff is hard to use, even if you can create amazing stuff with it. So let's combine together. Let's build a system that combines together people who are really good with the technology, who can create scenarios in which other people can create. And then here, you know, people who come in, don't want to learn anything, can just type in dog. And if you're doing it in the cyborg, you know, series, then you can get an amazing, you know, cyborg dog, create 100 of them if you want, pick your favorite one and mint it to the collection. That was basically the pitch of what I was doing.
And so that blends perfectly together. Like, this merger just makes so much sense to me. And I'd like to get into some of the logistics behind the merger. I know some things are probably confidential, but
Tell you what I can.
maybe you can share what you can about like how y'all started the conversation and were able to kind of merge the companies.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, the way we started the conversation was I pulled in Marguerite, the CEO over at Blockade and founder of Blockade. And like I said, we had a relationship going back about 10 years, just kind of, you know, in the same orbits, working together occasionally on casual stuff. And I was like, hey, we're creating this music video product, because that's what we were doing at the time. You're an artist, come play with this and tell me what you think of it. And so I had asked her to come and play with the thing a couple of times. So this is the first time I got her, because I sent her some stuff that was pretty impressive. And so she comes over, she starts playing with the tool. And maybe about a half hour later, she's like, hey, I am creating game characters with this. And like, this seems like this is much better than the way we do things today, was essentially the conversation. And then from there, it was a very short conversation to, hey, can I buy you? Which was very flattering. And then that conversation over the course of 2 months matured into a conversation about a merger. And basically, just trying to win this race. And, both Marguerite and I had built lots of product and, had been successful in our own ways. But we hadn't really built anything that was substantially meaningful to like a large number of people who actually were trying to do work. And that's been an aspiration of mine for a very long time. So that was kind of it in a nutshell as far as where it came from. That conversation started in September. That was when I pulled her in to look at the music video product. We signed a binding letter of intent at the end of November. So just a couple of months later. And then by the middle of December, we had basically merged in practice the two companies together, although the paperwork would take some time longer. And we just started running from there. A merger is a very paperwork intensive thing. So I'll just say that had I known exactly how much paperwork I was committing to going into it, then I might have done something different. But now at the end of the process, I'm happy with how everything went.
Yeah, it's a heck of an undertaking to go through those processes.
I can't wait until the whole GPT lawyer thing is
yeah.
maybe 2x better than it is right now because it's close.
Yeah, it's starting to help out with like parking tickets and easy stuff. I think it's going to be super important to have for like terms of service and things like that. Just have a bot as a Chrome extension that can call out red flags in terms of service for people.
I mean, a merger document is like a 95-page long, computer program written in the dumbest language ever for doing something, that has to be canonical where everybody understands it, which is of course the English language. So like that's the challenge. Is like what I loved about it in that process was being able to take a clause that I didn't understand and be like, what does this mean if I'm this party, right? And it can be, mostly wrong, but it still is interesting. And for the most part, it was just as informative as working with the actual lawyers who I was working with. So I think it's a great, again, amplifying technology, but moving on.
So did you like A/B test a little bit?
I did.
Because you had like lawyers, I assume, that were a part of the process, but you were able to kind of test the back and forth between the AI versus the lawyer.
So the nice part about ChatGPT versus lawyers is that if you have to go to a lawyer and you have to ask them to explain something to you, then that takes X amount of time. If you have to go to them,
they probably charge you for it too.
Of course, they charge you for it. Absolutely, right? Like the cheapest lawyer I've ever worked with in this type of context, like $350 an hour. So I mean, like you're paying dollars per minute, right? Per minute. And then when you're, but if you can go to GPT-4 and be like, hey, explain this to me, and then you ask the guy, hey, is this right? Then that's a much shorter answer, right? And so it allows you to do that type of vetting. But even like, I didn't actually use any of this stuff in practice, but some of the things I explored was like, what happens if you take an email thread that has a negotiation in it and you pop it into this and you say, hey, create a binding letter of intent that captures all the deal points that we've discussed here, right? If you were doing that, with a lawyer, then there would be a lot of questions that it would come back, and it would probably be right, but it would have taken probably, an hour, 2 hours worth of work at the absolute minimum. With this, again, like you get it, you pay $20 a month for the service, you get it back almost immediately. Who cares if it's a little wrong? Because you give that to the lawyer then, and you say, hey, this is what I want to do, as you understand it, right? And, and you can kind of go from there. So no, I mean, like the thing about all of these technologies is that we don't really understand how they're going to be used. And we know that they're both really powerful in that they break monopolies, right? Right now, lawyers have a monopoly on being able to interpret the law for pay. But they also act as incredible force multipliers for those people, such that, like a single lawyer could do the work that would typically have required, a support staff, because now you can have an AI that does that stuff. We're not there yet to the place where the quality is good enough, but we are getting there rapidly. And it's one of just dozens and dozens of areas that are going to be disrupted.
It's getting really close.
Getting really close.
Like GPT-4 is doing some good marketing with their like passing the bar at the 90th percentile and some of those things they put out. Like that's a great way to frame it for people so they can really understand it. I actually have a buddy in law school right now, and last time we hung out, like we went through some of his old legal tests, and we just started asking ChatGPT the same questions, and like we'd riff on what grade would you give ChatGPT on this stuff. And it was, not perfect, but a lot of the questions, it was pretty damn close. So I was really impressed by that. I kind of joke that Sam Altman is like a modern day Oppenheimer, where it's like he's building this thing that, someone's going to build it, and there's this responsibility to like try and build it in the right hands or whatever. And The thing though is there's that quote, right, which is like, I am the destroyer of worlds, as after the atomic bomb, versus with AI, with simulation theory, I kind of been playing with this in my head the last week, where I'm like, I'm the creator of worlds, which is kind of what Blockade Labs is, a piece of that, where you're creating the environments at scale. Like you're able to just spin them up, right?
I mean, the vision with Blockade Labs, when you really draw back the lens, is this idea we've been talking about for coming up on a year now, called text to game. And the idea is that today, if you wanted to create a prototype of a game, that prototype would take a lot of work, like somewhere between weeks and years worth of work, depending on the complexity of your concept. And that means that we can't go after really wild ideas. We can't prototype them because it doesn't make sense, because they're probably not going to work. But in a world where you have your crazy idea, you type it in, or you say it to the AI, and you say, like, I want to test a survival game set in Victorian Europe with mice as characters and all lines are sung, and there's a dynamic that involves banana guns. I don't know. Like, that would be a dumb game to prototype in real life. But if you do that and then it cascades its way through different various AI engines, of which Blockade would be one, we see ourselves fitting into that in the environments area, but also in the textures area and also in the meshes area. Then at the end of that process, maybe a couple hours later, depending on kind of the complexity of what you're doing, you have a prototype and you can play with that prototype. And that prototype means that, that idea that your 9-year-old had, that's like a terrible idea to you that no human, adult would ever want to do, but turns out it's amazing for 9-year-olds and they freaking love it, right? Like that game gets to get made now, and you could create a prototype, which then gets shared. And that prototype then gets popular, and now suddenly your 9-year-old, has like a giant viral franchise, and if they want to, has the ability to kind of expand beyond that. But even if it's a failure, well, it didn't cost you hardly anything, right? And it took almost no time. And the process of creation, especially for something new, is just fundamentally fun. Like that was kind of one of the revelations that I had a couple of years ago, was that even if this stuff is terrible, the act of doing it and evoking, we really kind of lean into this magic thing, because the way that prompts work today is like magical incantations, right? It's not human language. It's an arcane listing of all of these concepts that you want to be represented, right? And so it's a very specific language, but that in and of itself is on its way out. And like this multimodal thing that OpenAI has been talking about, and like the type of connections, that's stuff that we've been thinking about for a long time. And in fact, have built in particular one tool into our product called Enhanced Prompt.
I saw that. I was playing around with it last week. It's pretty cool.
It's amazing.
Can you? It's basically like it optimizes the prompt, right? Like
So I mean, so something that we noticed with users coming in, again, going back to the PixelMind kind of revelations, was that this stuff is super powerful, but there's a huge learning curve, and it's not intuitive, and people are now in a post ChatGPT world. They're now used to talking to it. But it doesn't really work like that for most of the types of engines that you're looking at. So what we did, and this was a feature that I just like jammed on at the very end right before a release, and it just happened super fast because it was actually pretty easy, was to take all of our kind of best prompting guidance and all of our expert stuff, feed it into an LLM, and then have that LLM basically sitting there such that when a user comes in and they type something like forest, which is a classic prompt that you'll get from people who are just trying out the tool, or any other single or 2-word thing, then it will take it, send it off to the AI. The AI then comes back, and you've got this, 2-sentence long, exactly as it needs to be, expansion of your prompt, and then it creates that. And the quality that's possible is kind of night and day. It really takes kind of those novice users out there and makes it so that they are, on par with maybe an 80% expert user. So it's a big upgrade for me because I'm not an expert user with all this stuff. I intentionally kind of keep myself on the, like user surrogate side, where I use things in really lazy ways because I'm lazy when it comes to this type of tool. But it helps me to understand how our users are using it, as opposed to some of the experts on our team who are like, oh yeah, just toss in, I don't know. I don't know what they do, but they create amazing things that I can't really get my head around.
As I hear you talk about this, like it's opening my mind up to, because for me, Blockade Labs, part of why I reached out to you guys is I played around with the skyboxes and I've seen all the videos like a lot of people have, and When I was at Engage, we used you guys a lot for playing around. Like Chris Madsen absolutely loves creating skyboxes with Blockade Labs, and it's awesome. Like we can spin up so many cool environments so quickly. But the way you talk about this idea of like prompt generating games, like that's the vision of where this can go. Is it's not just about the environments; it's all the things you can build into these games. And it makes me look back at a conversation I had with Travis Boudreau from Azure Games. And the big thing that we talked about was how he's using AI internally to basically optimize the game development process. So they're starting with worlds, like the environment stuff, kind of like the skyboxes. It's like anything that's environmental, they try to use AI for as much of that as possible because it's like the least personal, the least emotional connection for a user. And then NPCs is like half and half. It's like some AI, but like still a lot of human creation into that process. And then characters, that's all the emotional connection that people have. That's the big one, that you need someone to feel very deeply connected with the characters they're playing and the villains they're fighting against. And so that's where they dedicate most of their human creativity to. And so I was curious, as you develop this, like obviously there's a huge B2C side of this, of like a ton of creators or developers coming in and using the tool. But is there also a B2B side where you work with gaming studios to kind of offer this as an optimization tool for them?
Yeah, so when we started building this tool, we thought that it was primarily going to be primarily going to be attractive to game studios, right? So like medium game studios was like our initial target. People who aren't doing AAA, but also, you know, have a budget. And in practice, what we found is that we lowered the bar so much to having this type of environment that we discovered some significant market opportunities that were entirely outside of gaming. And what's kind of come to me recently is our product right now is at 0.7.2. So we're technically about 3 major feature releases away from being at what I will consider 1.0.
That's wild, by the way.
I know it is.
With how valuable your product already is, it's crazy to think you don't even consider it 1.0 yet.
Yeah, no, it's you know, like there's a vision that's here, and we have 1 or 2 other, like I said, major steps. The big one is going to be iterative development. Right now, if you create a skybox, then you create a new skybox, and if you remix a skybox, you remix the entire skybox. And we have a system coming that we've long teased called Add to This. That is basically the ability to go in and make small changes anywhere you want. It's not in painting in a true sense. We had to come up with our own version of in painting to deal with much larger spaces, but it's very similar in that way, and it's the first of several tools we have coming out on that side. My point just is that when you're talking about an audience that didn't have access to a thing before, giving them access is the compelling value proposition, and they get the value right away. When you're talking about people whose expertise is in the creation of high quality assets of this type, they're a little bit more demanding, and rightly so, because the stakes are a lot higher for them, and they already have good processes to do these things. They're just expensive and time consuming. So that's what we're going towards, is next year. I think that's when really we're going to turn our focus to game studios. But as it stands right now, again, like we just had like the biggest customer that just came on, and we've had really been very happy with the monetization, but was a company that services retirement homes. And they create immersive experiences in like a room. And so they're using us as the projector, but then they have wind machines and they have, you know, ambient sound machines that go in. And so it's like, that's a use case we never considered, but they've bought our most expensive package, you know, and are happy with it, are moving forward with it. And it's kind of wild. So like that's one of a ton of different opportunities that fall into this broad category that I call companies who don't have environments as their primary use case, but who, if given an environment and the ability to create an environment, would like to do something with it, and it would increase the value of their overall product. So yeah, the game stuff is coming, but like whenever you look at these professional areas, it's always going to be the hobbyist side that's going to come in first, because they just think it's cool. So we're somewhere in the middle of that journey. I'd say we're probably, like I said, about 75%. To the place where I'll consider our quality really good enough to start pushing hard on that market.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense to me. Like there's this boom in like creative software tools. Like Figma was acquired by Adobe for 20 billion.
Yeah.
Runway ML, I think will probably be their next big target. I think their valuation's like 1.5 now or something like that. And this, I think, fits into that same creative category, right? And the cool thing about what you guys are doing is because the emphasis is on generating for three-dimensional environments, you're tapping into something that I think Adobe can't just munch up into their system, right? Like they're so focused on the AI Photoshop side and the photo video visuals, and they brought in Frame.io is the other big acquisition they did, right? So like they're so focused on that stuff that trying to jump into the 3D side, I think, is a little harder. So it's easier for you guys to have a little bit of a moat around what you guys are kind of creating. Who would be some examples? Like, I don't want you to like shill your competitors, but like, who are the folks that you would say are like most similar to you or are working on kind of similar things at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it depends on what lens you look at this through. If we're talking about this from the lens of skyboxes, then honestly, the competitor that we have is probably like Fiverr. You know, like there isn't really anybody out there. We've seen a couple of companies that have briefly tried and then pulled their products from the markets because it's kind of hard. And one of the nice things about it getting there first is that we got there first. And so as a result of that, we got the virality that came with it. We got the name recognition that came with it. Most of the time when we see a project pop up that looks like it's using something that we would create, they're like, yeah, we created that with you. So that's been great. There's a broader ambition. So I talked about kind of like the end state that we think all this is going towards, which is this kind of composable text to game thing. But there are intermediary steps to get there. And one of the intermediary steps to get to text to game is kind of continuing the magic trick that we've been pulling this entire time, which is that we're not generating a 3D space. We're generating a 2D image that has 3D characteristics baked into it, and then we are wrapping it around a sphere such that it feels like it's a 3D space where you're standing in the middle of it. We call it a snow globe internally. The advantage of that approach is that it's very fast, and you can get we're leveraging some open source ideas and then a lot of internal kind of proprietary stuff that we've done to be able to produce. I think it's about 9 seconds of actual GPU time that we produce these 6K skyboxes individually in, which is very, very fast. Forgot what I was going to say.
Using spheres to make it faster.
The magic
by
trick.
Having the sphere
Yeah.
mesh. And,
Yeah. So already we before we released monetization, the most common request that we got was, hey, I created my scene and I downloaded it, but I got an image, not a video. Where's my video? People thinking that what they see in the actual browser is that and not understanding it, right? So we're already kind of pulling a magic trick to make that happen. What we figured out maybe 7 months ago, at this point, 6 months ago, something like that, was that AI as a sort of fancy form of autocomplete, right? If you can fake something, then you can do something. And so we figured out a couple of different ways, of which we're currently pretty far down the path on one, where we could actually extract and create real 3D spaces from those 2D spaces. And then from there, we figured out how we can expand them such that they actually become complete kind of perspective spaces. We're not working on that part right now. We're working on the other part right now, but we know how we're going to do that one, and it's a pretty straightforward path. So that's kind of the idea here, is that imagine a world where instead of prototyping a scene by creating concept art, and then that being the easiest part of the process, what if that was the hardest part of the process? And it was really just about staying in kind of ideation and discovery mode until you find exactly what you want. And then at that point, you perform a little magic trick and you turn it from a picture of a space into the space itself. That is such a fundamental throw out the rule book in terms of the way that we do things right now that, again, it's hard to understand where it goes. But the thing that we know is that a lot more stuff gets created. A lot more people have the power to create. And so we can get closer to better, more creative ideas that wouldn't work in the traditional paradigm, but very much do work in this new paradigm. So that would be the primary takeaway from that, is that if you can fake it, then you can probably do it, because AI is magic.
You're sparking so many ideas, man. Like, I think that for writers in a film room that are making a movie, imagine that you come up with this is the thing, props to the writers and the writer strike. I'm stoked that they're able to get paid fairly, and they have some protections on AI. It worked out really well for the writers. But I still hope that the writers don't write off AI and that they take it on as a tool. Because I think, from my perspective, if you're a writer or a director, that should be the most exciting position for this stuff right now, is like in the writer's room, you could now imagine 100 different variations of the idea that's in your head, and then literally put on a headset and hop in those skyboxes and hop into those environments and be like, oh, this one feels right. This is the color scheme we should be going for, and use that as your pitch to producers or your mock-up of the storyboard, and have it be more interactive versus just kind of on a piece of paper or on a flat digital screen. So cool, Adam. The stuff you guys are working on is amazing. This episode kind of went into two categories. I might split it into two. I'm going to have to think about that, because I think the Web3 crypto audience is slightly different than the XR kind of gaming audience and 3D environments. But so much knowledge in one person, man. I would love to bring you back eventually later on when we've got some more time for it. But as we wrap up, where can people find you? Where can people learn about Blockade Labs? How do they stay up to date with these stories?
Yeah, so you can visit blockadelabs.com just to kind of get general information. The product itself is available, with free usage, although there are paid plans also that if you use it a lot, you'll need to go to. That's at skybox.blockadelabs.com, so go and check it out if you want. You can find information about me at adamblevine.com, but my webpage is pretty out of date at this point. So, I don't do social media anymore. I don't do anything but work on this stuff, man. Like, I'm just like so far down these rabbit holes, it's not even funny. But yeah, no, the future is here, and it's weird, and it's going to get so much more weird in the next 2 years that I can't even, I can see maybe 3 months in the future at this point, which is a wildly short time frame for me.
Yeah.
So it's pretty wild.
Yeah, true builder, man. Everything changes. There's too many variables. So like every month, it's like the future outlook just shifts more and more. It's why we got to focus on defining start lines and not finish lines, because we'll never get there if we focus too much on 10 years out.